Now, learned or not, he was as much a child of the Enlightenment as Jefferson or Adams. Only his Enlightenment was a very down-to-earth affair, concerned with behaving properly in the everyday world of people. Washington lived his life by the book, not the book of military rules, but the book of gentility. He was as keenly aware as any of his fellow Americans of the 18th century conventions that defined gentility. Such conventions were expressed in much of the writings of the Enlightenment, the thousands of etiquette books, the didactic stories, the Spectator papers, Roger de Coverley papers, Addison Steele, Hogarth prints, gentlemanly magazines, classical histories. All of these were designed to teach Englishmen manners, civility, gentility, and virtue. Out of all this writing and art emerged an ideal of what it was to be cultivated, what it was to be civilized. Our perpetuation of a liberal arts education in colleges and universities is a present-day reminder of the origins of this ideal. For the English conception of a liberally educated gentleman had its modern beginnings in the 18th century. In the 19th century, if they asked, why are you going to Princeton, they would have said, to make the young man a gentleman. And that remained for 100 years at least. An enlightened, civilized man was disinterested and impartial, not swayed by self-interest and self-profit. He was cosmopolitan. He stood above the local and parochial considerations, and he was willing to sacrifice his personal desires for the greater good of his community or his country. He was a man of reason who was supposed to resist the passions most likely to afflict gentlemanly elites. Such a liberally educated gentleman avoided enthusiasms and fanaticisms of all sorts, especially those of religion. Tolerance and liberality were his watchwords. Politeness and compassion towards his fellow men were his manners. Behaving in this way was what constituted being civilized. Washington was thoroughly caught up in this enlightened promotion of gentility and civility, this rational rolling back of parochialism, fanaticism, and barbarism. He certainly went to church regularly, but he was not an emotionally religious person. In all of his writings, there's only one reference that we can find to Christ. And he usually referred to God as that great disposer of events. He was, as he said, no bigot myself to any mode of worship. His 1790 letter to the Jewish synagogue of Newport, Rhode Island, is a classic Enlightenment expressions, not of mere toleration, but rather of true religious liberty. He draws that distinction in that letter, very important distinction. He loved Addison's play Cato, and he saw it over and over and incorporated some of its lines into his correspondence. The play, which is very much an Enlightenment tract, helped to teach him what it meant to be liberal and virtuous, what it meant to be a stoical, classical hero. The first important document we have of Washington's life is his rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation, a collection of 110 maxims that Washington wrote down sometime before his 16th birthday, copying them out. The maxims were originally drawn from a 17th century etiquette book and were, as I say, copied out by this young autodidact. They dealt with everything from how to treat one's betters. In speaking to men of quality, do not lean or look them full in the face, to how to present one's countenance. Do not puff up the cheeks, loll out the tongue, rub the hands or beard, thrust out the lips or bite them, or keep the lips too open or too closed. These are the kinds of things he copied out. Now, all the founding fathers were aware of these enlightened conventions, and all in varying degrees tried to live up to them. But no one of them was more serious in following them than Washington. It's this purposefulness that gave his behavior such a copybook character. He was obsessed with having things in fashion, and he was fastidious about his appearance, the way he appeared to the world. It was as if he were always on stage, acting a part. He was very desirous of not to offend and he exquisitely shaped his remarks to fit the person to whom he was writing. So anxious was he to appear neat and correct in his letters, Benjamin Rush later claimed, that he was known to copy over a letter of 2 or 3 sheets of paper because there were a few erasures on it. He wanted desperately to know what the proper rules of behavior were for a liberally educated gentleman. And when he discovered these rules, he stuck by them with an earnestness that awed his contemporaries. His remarkable formality and stiffness in company came from his very self-consciousness, a very self-conscious sense of what he considered to be the right genteel behavior. He wanted to cultivate that behavior. But his behavior in private life was not the source of his greatness. Neither were his military exploits during the Revolutionary War. He was not a traditional military hero. He had no smashing, stunning victories during the war, and Trenton was a great tactical victory, but it's really small potatoes. His tactical and strategic maneuvers were not generally the sort that awed men. He did not resemble Alexander, Caesar, Cromwell, or Marlborough, and his military achievements were nothing compared to those that Napoleon would soon have. It was his behavior beyond the blood and dust of the battlefield that really established his reputation as a great man. During the dark days of the Revolution, he could have become a dictator. In fact, there were people suggested that maybe he could become our first king, which horrified Washington. In March 1783 at Newburgh, New York, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with this incident, he single-handedly put down a military threat by the officers of the Continental Army, a threat where they wanted to march on the Congress and get what they wanted, their salaries and respect that they had felt they had earned. It was a meeting maybe in a stage like this. I think there must have been about 50 officers, and maybe you know this better than I. Really, he was a master of timing, and at the appropriate moment, while they're discussing what they might do, he walks onto the stage, and many of them, I think, were surprised, and he gives this impassioned speech, a kind of band of brothers speech. I was with you. I was there. Not like General Howe, who went off to a hotel with his prostitute and his mistress and soft sheets. He was out there on the battlefield at Valley Forge. And he gave that speech, and then at one point near the end, he says, I want to read you a letter from a congressman who is promising doing something for us. And he pulls out his spectacles, his glasses, and there's a gasp among many of the officers who didn't know that he needed glasses to read. And he pauses with just the perfect timing. He says, yes, gentlemen, I have grown nearly blind as well as gray in the service of my country. Well, at this point, the whole group collapses in tears, and the attempted coup, and it is the closest, I think, we've ever come to a military coup d'etat in our history. And Washington single-handedly put it down with that very, very sincere appeal of abandoned brothers.